All right, we are here. Welcome, everybody. Digital Hammurabi, Dr. Josh. I have Dr. Gina Konstantopoulos. Did I say it right?
Konstantopoulos.
Konstantopoulos. You know, I should have
There
asked
you
you that before we started. 'Cause I was like, oh, no, I totally know how to pronounce that. It's Helsinki, Sweden.
go. You might have to explain that
Yeah, yeah. For those
the
of you,
non-diehard fans in the room.
diehard fans, Die Hard 1, there's a scene where the the reporter is interviewing somebody about oh gosh, what's the where you identify with your captors?
Yes, he's talking about Stockholm syndrome, but
Stockholm
he's
syndrome.
calling it,
That's
I
what it
think,
is.
Helsinki syndrome is
He
the
says
joke.
he says yeah. So from Helsinki and Helsinki, Sweden, Finland. And I was saying that's what I hear in my head every time I hear the word Helsinki. So I have problems, is what I'm trying to say. Okay. So we are here today to talk about cosmic geography. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun and a very interesting topic. So I will give just a little brief introduction, and then I'm going to let Dr. Konstantopoulos introduce herself and her amazing work. But we live in a period of, a lot of scientific advancement, philosophical understanding, those sorts of things. And I think that because of that, we often will look to ancient texts like the Bible, like ancient Akkadian and Sumerian writings, Egyptian writings. And we will say, oh, those primitives, those people that didn't understand all the basic things that we understand. And we sort of look down on them. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. One, they weren't privy to all the advancements that we have today. So, I think that's a little condescending, frankly. And we want to make sure that we, as people that are trying to do good scholarship, that we don't take that approach. That being said, we also don't want to try to project our advanced understanding of science back onto ancient texts. And this happens a lot, I think, in the Bible. It can happen also in other ancient Near Eastern texts. And one of the places that this sort of happens, be it through a type of cognitive dissonance or just trying to reread the text to make it fit, what we understand today through our eyes, is cosmic geography, right? What did they think the world looked like? What did they think that, for example, we know today that the Earth is a globe, right? Did they know that? Spoiler alert, no, they did not. And unfortunately, when we see those sorts of things, references to the four corners of the earth, the four corners of the world, or to a dome that is over that is this solid thing up there called the sky, through which eagles can fly and take humans. We have problems with that because we look at this. Sometimes we look at the biblical text and we say this is a sacred text, this is a holy text, to the point that it is inerrant, it is inspired, and so we have to figure out a way to make it not say what it says. There's not a firmament up there. It means something else. At any rate, so I wanted to bring someone on that has wrestled with some of these issues, and she wrote a paper recently, right? 2018 was the paper, talking about spaces, cosmic spaces, and
Yes, it was actually part of a volume that came out that was part of the publication of a workshop I did while I was still at ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. So really dealing with this idea of how we think about, or rather how various ancient, primarily Mesopotamian societies think about space in their own conceptions of the edges of their own world. So my own article was really an introduction to the general volume, but then also kind of a case study of some of the ways in which space and place and conceptions thereof work in various periods of Mesopotamian history. Okay, yeah, sorry.
Awesome.
Hey, you can't. Yeah, this is what has already happened.
No, this is the best part of the stream, always, when the cats come in.
Yeah, you can stay if you behave, which is a contradiction in terms with you. Well,
awesome. Well, we're going to get into some of that here in a few minutes, but I would be a terrible, terrible host if I didn't give a little bit of background, and then, you can please talk as much as you like about some of your other research interests. But let me just give a brief introduction to Dr. Konstantopoulos' educational background and history. So I'm just going to read this because I think it's better than me fumbling my way through it. So to lead us on our journey, we are joined by Dr. Gina Konstantopoulos, a brilliant scholar and a good friend of us here at Digital Hammurabi. She's going to hate me for saying that. Sorry.
That's right. I just almost took a tail to the face here.
She received her PhD in Ancient Near Eastern Studies in 2015 from the University of Michigan, where she studied with Dr. Michalowski. Her dissertation, They Are Seven, Demons and Monsters in the Mesopotamian Textual and Artistic Tradition, focuses on a particular group of demonic beings known as the Seven. Dr. Konstantopoulos earned a position as a visiting professor at the prestigious Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University from 2015 to 17, and is currently holds a postdoc at the University of Helsinki, Finland.
Yes.
Everybody knows.
Not Sweden.
Not Sweden. It is an honor to speak with you again, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart. We had a lot of fun talking out in Denver, and I'm really glad to finally get you on the channel. That's not a dig in any way. I'm just really excited to get you on the channel. Sorry. She is extraordinarily busy, as we all are. So I'm happy that she's able to get some free time to come and talk to us. So would you mind taking a couple of minutes and introducing yourself to the audience, maybe talking about your current research, publications, where they can find you on social media, what your favorite color is, etc.
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for having me on. I know that we were kind of trying to make a time work since Denver, and I'm glad it finally did. So as you said, my dissertation and sort of a lot of the work I did in connection with that and the work I'm still doing was really focused on issues of magic and demons and monsters in Mesopotamia, as well as how those concepts, demonic or monstrous or otherwise, influence other connected cultures and time periods. So my dissertation was on this group called the 🀭, or the Seven, because there are 7 of them. It's not a terribly inventive name as far as monstrous terminology goes, but it does work. It does what it says on the tin, I suppose. So I was looking at this group of monsters, or demons really, I should say, that are very much, harbingers of destruction on a cosmic scale. They have these terrifying references and imagery associated with them. They bring floods. They're, lions with gaping maws, and etc. All of these really fearful imagery. But at the same time, starting actually in the south, in Babylonia, and quite early as the first Sealand dynasty, but then more consistently in the Kassite period. So we're in, mid to just past mid 2nd millennium BC, we start to see temples dedicated to them. So they acquire this divine quality. And then we have Assyria, Tukulti-Ninurta sacks Babylon and comes back and then builds a temple to them in the north. So he seems to take the cult of the 🀭 with him. And from that point on, they're very much associated with Assyria and the Assyrian Empire. And what happens that I found really interesting is they get incorporated into the state pantheon. They're sort of these attack dogs of the state. And as long as you keep them occupied, killing your enemies, presumably, they're not going to turn and destroy the homeland, which is actually what they do in one of the texts dedicated to them called the Epic of Era, which I mention specifically because it has the best line ever. where they're complaining to the god Era how upset they are that they haven't had enough slaughter to do, and they just go, "Our blades are corroded for want of a slaughter," which is, a great line, objectively speaking. So I was interested in how they functioned as demons that were also deities, and how they also functioned as really kind of markers for shifting aspects of Mesopotamian, but more particularly both Babylonian and Assyrian religion, particularly Assyrian in the first millennium. So my own work has continued looking at other demons and conceptions of the demonic. And then I think my party line is that I moved from liminal beings to liminal spaces.
There you go.
Which works as a transition. So while I'm still very interested in working a lot with magic and demons, because demons are great and everyone should look at them, they're very instructive. Like what we're afraid of reveals a lot about what we think and feel and believe in as a society, particularly about things that might be so innate we don't write about them otherwise. One of the things I like to do with my students is make them invent a demon, and it's always like invent a demon that is representative of something going on in what you would think of as a demon of something in society, and you get great ones like the demon of the last piece of cake that no one wants to eat. I'm trying to remember who came. Something like that, that thing that happens that everyone agrees but never talks about. I asked this of a friend of mine and he suggested something like the demon of twitching curtains in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business. So it's nicely reflective of what we think but don't discuss necessarily. So my current research and the big project I'm working on now, in addition to turning my dissertation into a book, which needs to happen with increasing, shall we say, alacrity, is looking at these conceptions of space and the edges of the earth in Mesopotamia, particularly in the second and first millennium BC. I mean, we can just assume all of our dates are in BC, but
it's the only interesting period, really. I mean, if we're honest.
Useless in the AD, or the CE rather.
There you go.
So here I'm looking at a number of very specific distant locations. So the cedar forest, the sea or the ocean in various representations and references, the island of Dilmun, which is modern-day Bahrain, Magan, which is Oman mostly, Meluha, which is kind of the Indus Valley. And if you look at these collectively, these become kind of the farthest edges to the Mesopotamian worldview. But all of them, with the exception of Arata, which is located to the east and only appears in literary texts, and even if I'm not going to rule out the possibility that there is an actual location called Arata, but as they discuss it, it's not moored to that particular reality. So it's the only arguably fictional location in this list. There are these very distant locations and they're connected to them and they know they exist, but they're so far away that despite trade and military conquest and actual contact, they become these sorts of fantastical imaginings of locations. So they're a really interesting interplay of myth and reality, and it allows them to also serve as one of these canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, of how space is thought of in Mesopotamia. And the idea is to look at these shifting locations and their interplay with each other, and then kind of get a conceptual idea of how Mesopotamia, I say Mesopotamia, but of course it's very different from Assyria or Babylonia, and even different cities think of different spaces in different ways. But that's all too much to say. So just Mesopotamia is conceiving of the world around it and where its edges lie and how they shift. So it's kind of the arc of my project now, which is in various stages of intense research and then working on other things and then back to it.
It's amazing. Just so everybody remembers, we read through, part of the Enmerkar cycle. So actually, I think we've gone through, at least in summary fashion, both the Enmerkar stories, Lord of Arata and Sukashtana. But we read through both Lugalbanda stories. No, it's great. It's great.
Yeah. She's behaving herself, so she can stay.
It is the cutest
Um,
thing. We read through both of the Lugalbanda stories in our Saturday night Digital Hammurabi book club, which was always a lot of fun reading through Lugalbanda. So, but Arata is this, as she was talking about, is this, the city off to the east through the seven mountains, and that Enmerkar and his army from Uruk, and of course Lugalbanda is one of the, the great. He's the eighth warrior that falls ill in the mountains and then comes back with the help of the gods. So yeah, this it's very interesting to think about these. Arguably, I think finer points of how they consider these liminal spaces in the outside of their geography. But I think that.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say I really love the geography you get in the Lugalbanda stories in particular. I mean, you kind of view, I think, you have the Lugalbanda duology and then the Enmerkar connected epics, and they really function in some regards as a quartet. But this idea of Arata that is so far away that, when Lugalbanda is venturing, and 7 is this cosmic number, it transitions people to different types of space or different types of time, even in many texts where it appears. Gilgamesh and Huwawa, they go to the cedar forest and have to go through 7 mountain ranges. But he gets lost, and then he gets lost in a highland that doesn't know Cyprus, or he gets lost in a place that is so far distant it doesn't even have these markers of distance that are these particular trees. And then he finally gets to Arata after acquiring this magical speed, and the text kind of breaks because the whole point is the journey, and now he can get rid of the journey element, so it runs out of an ability to deal with that and has to wind things up. But also just Arata is so far away, and yet it's just like Uruk plus Lapis, which is, I think, one of the, I always use this line, but there's a great line in Invisible Cities, Italo Calvino, and it just goes, elsewhere is a negative mirror. And there's more to it, but that's kind of the key point. You realize what about your own locations is present by what is different in foreign ones. So to have a city that is so far away, but it's just like Uruk plus Lapis.
And it always needs to be rescued. It seems like they gotta go over there and get them out of their famines and stuff, even though they're fighting them. Well, I'm interested. One of the reasons that I thought it would be fantastic to bring you on is, I have these discussions with people all the time here on YouTube, and we end up talking about what is the conception. Let me say it a slightly different way. If you've spent any time on YouTube, you have probably encountered the flat Earth debate.
Yeah,
I was out at Megan and I were out at the dinner with faculty members from Hopkins, and it was the strangest thing because I said somebody was talking about this satellite that had been up in space, and I'm going to say more than I know, which is rare for me. But this satellite was apparently up in space, and it was taking measurements. It had been up for some time, and the next day after this dinner, all these results, all these new calculations, astronomical calculations, were going to come back in. They were going to be downloaded, and it was going to render so many of these papers that had been written by astronomers sort of obsolete because this new data was going to supersede or correct all the things that they were. That morning there was a conference, and people were just going through their papers as quickly as they could to get them presented before they became obsolete. But at any rate, he's telling us about this and about all these different things that this thing is calculating. And I said, isn't it funny that there are so many people that think the Earth is flat? And there was this silence. And he went, people don't think that. I said, they do.
They do.
And so one of the things that I come up against is there's this big battle here on YouTube with normal people trying to convince less than normal people. I don't know. That's not nice. But people of this particular persuasion that no, the Earth is a globe. It's not flat. If you go up, you're not going to hit your head on a solid mass up there in the sky, unless there's a plane up there, I suppose. But and the Bible often gets cited, and ancient Near Eastern texts will sometimes get cited, not as frequently, as evidence for a flat Earth. Which it always puts me in a precarious position because I say, well, yeah, that's true. It does say there's a big dome up there of sorts, that it's solid, and you can go through it. But so I thought maybe it would be good to have a stream like this, where we sort of talk about cosmic geography and couch that in the context of, even though they believed these things and understood these things this way, believe is a strange word, but in that context, but understood their surroundings in that way or their world in that way, that does not necessitate that it was correct as far as what we know of reality, and that it was part of their, what they understand given their cultural context and what they knew. So, but I thought it would be good to just kind of go through cosmic geography in general. And there is a book that I know that you have probably consumed many times, but Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography by Horowitz is an excellent, at least an introduction. He really deals with a lot of different topics in here. If you know about the Babylonian Map of the world, he deals with that. He deals with just sort of the basic layout of Mesopotamian cosmic geography, and there's some references here to the biblical texts, but an excellent resource for what we're going to talk about today. And of course, I'm sure you have many other resources that you could mention, but I just wanted to point that out. It's an Eisenbrauns publication, Mesopotamian Civilizations. I can't remember which one, but you can get it on Eisenbrauns, or I'm sure you can get it on Amazon. But anyway, so before I start asking you questions, did you want to correct me on anything there, or do you defend a flat Earth position, a modern flat Earth position, and I've really offended you?
I emphatically do not. There's actually a kind of hilarious video by a YouTuber. He recently did this massive stream for this charity called Mermaids, a UK charity that provides support to transgender youth, and that he played Donkey Kong 64 for something like 56 hours and raised, I think, upwards of $300,000. But he has this kind of great response to flat earthers that I actually like, because it goes through, and I think even he kind of approaches points where he's just losing it a bit. I'm trying to remember it's like H. Bomber guy, but he's very easy to find. But yeah, this idea that, I think to some degree a lot of this ties into an interesting other side of, it's almost like the flip side of the ancient aliens coin. Because on the one side you have the ancient aliens people who, propagate this idea that ancient societies, unsurprisingly ones primarily not from Europe, could not have possibly been capable of these massive scientific and, primarily scientific and architectural and artistic achievements, which has its own deep problems, many of which tied into, racist ideas, to be blunt. But sort of the flip side of that is this interesting idea that you get of this, I'm really trying to think of the best way to describe it, this sort of sense that the civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia, although Egypt I think gets it more than we do, had this deeper knowledge that we haven't been able to access since, and that it's been lost. So one of the interests I have is also in reception of Mesopotamia, and particularly when we look at what happens right before and after World War II, when suddenly there's this interest in the textual reception of Mesopotamia and Sumerian in particular, and it gets hooked onto Lovecraft and all of this Necronomicon, and I'm not going to get into it, but this idea that this idea that Sumerian and Sumerian language in particular had this deeper power and deeper knowledge is, I think, part of why we have this, this pervasive concept of, well, if Egypt or Mesopotamia or the Bible, even disassociating in the case of the biblical world in particular, this from perspectives of faith, but this idea that if this was something that was believed by these cultures who had this knowledge and really wisdom that has since been lost by the modern world, then is there something to it? And that's probably more complicated an answer than you were initially looking for, but it's an interesting, I think, sort of subplot to some of this whole perspective of, but all of these ancient societies believed it. So what's going on there?
Yeah. So just so we're clear, you are saying that Sumerian doesn't hold secret power?
I mean,
damn it.
Alas, that despite all of our efforts on learning Sumerian, I do not know if we will ever be able to, hack and we won't have the power to neurolinguistically reprogram the human brain, which means that Snow Crash has lied to us all of these years.
I mean, Enki, we know that Enki had those test tubes.
Well, this whole, the Snow Crash, I'm a big fan of Snow Crash, but this idea of what he calls the Namsha, the basically incantations, having the ability to rewrite the human mind, basically the hacking language for humanity being Sumerian, is, to me, as someone who works in Sumerian, really cool.
Yeah.
In terms of practical logistics, I'm not sure how well it would actually work out, but...
Oh, gosh.
We were almost really relevant for a while there, if only.
All right. So Gina, there's something, I don't know how much if you watch the channel at all, but there's something called Super Chats, and it's something that people pay a specific amount of money, whatever they determine they're going to pay, and then we read them what they write out loud. And our thing is I read them in Kent Hovind's voice. Now, do you know who that is, Kent Hovind? I'm unsurprised.
I'm afraid not.
I'm unsurprised. Kent Hovind is a lecturer who is a young Earth creationist. Are you familiar with that term?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
so he argues against evolution as a career. And
this is, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm piecing this together now. I did museum studies as a graduate certificate at Michigan, and one of the museums we talked a lot about was the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. So yes, I've placed him in the context.
It's in that vein. That is correct. In intellectual iconoclasm, the demon of the plain text reading, Dr. Hovind is possessed by that one. Do it in the Hovind voice, please. Okay. Well, that's because of evolution. And so that's kind of what he sounds like. We also have one. So a super chat by Pope Benedict Rock. Cool, man, for £2. Thank you very much, Pope Benedict. Of course, we know that you're not a real Christian because you're Catholic, but okay, I'm here to help. We also have a question from Trevor Lunn before we get started. Okay, this is... Trevor, I'm beginning to believe you read her article, but maybe not. Was the concept of far away, here be dragons type locales also applicable vertically, down to wherever and up to what, heaven?
So yeah, of course, the fun thing about the here be dragons phrase is, of course, that it appears technically twice in all of maps and actual map images, the most notable of which is the Lenox globe, which is in the holdings of the New York Public Library, I believe. I think I'm right about that. But when we generally see it applied, we're looking at these creatures, be they dragons or, mushushu in the case of Mesopotamia, or monsters of other stripes, or even just wild animals that would be dangerous to someone's life and livelihood. They're certainly going to be located on the edges of things, particularly either in the steppe, the Eden, or the Hersog, the mountain ranges beyond it, or even the core of the mountains themselves. So we're certainly getting that concept that the further out you go, the more wild and the more dangerous. And I don't want to say the more supernatural, because that implies that these are aspects of the world that are seen as something unusual, more than natural, so to speak. And to the Mesopotamian mind, that would be a concept and a part of the world. Mm-hmm. It's the natural consequence of going to these locations. So within those places, it's not unusual for someone to think of encountering one of these creatures.
But supernatural from our perspective.
Yeah, exactly. It's a problem of word use. We think of it as, either a TV show that's it's going to outlast us all. I think they're on like 14 seasons. Or the concept of something that is more than natural and thus must be unusual or magical or so on. But it's a part of how they conceived of the world. So it certainly works laterally. In terms of whether or not it works vertically, it becomes a little more difficult, because you don't, the idea of where exactly the netherworld is, it's located in the core as a passage to the netherworld and an association to the netherworld as well. There's also a sense that it is located underneath in some concept. And you don't, with the exception of really a few literary texts, we can talk about this perhaps later when we get to the idea of the sky and heavens, you wouldn't progress upwards in a way that would allow you to encounter any of these beings. I think the closest we get is maybe in the text Maklu, or the burning, that deals with the witch, the idea that her spirit has to be carried to the heavens for the gods to deal with, because in the netherworld she would still be powerful enough to return and cause damage. So it's not really a clear-cut answer. There is certainly a presence of both supernatural or our dragons, so to speak, in above and below, but you wouldn't necessarily encounter them in either direction, because you wouldn't be moving in either direction unless you're the hero, the protagonist hero of one of these texts.
Or you drop a ball and it goes down, yes, and you have to go get it.
And you didn't listen. He had one rule.
When you go down there, here are 5 things that you can't do. Okay. I'll do them all, though, when I go down there.
And just get stuck. Gosh. Yeah, the netherworld operates on basically Hotel California rules. Just never. I'm not actually going to explain that joke. Clearly got it. But yes, generally, if someone's telling you what to do to not get stuck in the netherworld, or in the case of Greek myth, to lead someone out of the netherworld, don't look back. Don't do the 5 or so things that Gilgamesh tells you not to do, and you'll be okay. But somehow it always manages to not work out.
Yes. Interesting how it works. Well, so I know this is going to sound very basic, and I apologize for that, but I feel like there's some just foundational things that we need to all sort of agree on. And I have found, again, much to my chagrin, that me saying it and then citing textual evidence and then the consensus of scholarship doesn't always mean anything to some people that listen. So it's always good to get somebody else in here that knows more than I do to say, yes, that's true. So thank you for being that person. Okay, so in ancient Mesopotamia, what did they believe about the shape of the earth to be? And I put that in quotes for obvious reasons, I think. But was it considered a globe? Was it flat? And what? Yeah. So let's just start there. What would you say about that?
So, I mean, the short answer is they would have believed it to have been flat, but the longer answer is that I don't think they would have understood the question necessarily. Because, I mean, as you know, we don't get cartographic, i.e. drawn depictions of the world until really late. The Babylonian map of the world is the first one we get, and it's around 700 BC at the earliest dating, arguably. So most of what we have is coming from texts that are talking about the orientation and, landscape of the earth and the heavens from a really elite scribal expert perspective. So to what degree some of these reflected on what people actually thought about the layout of the world around them, if they did, is difficult to say.
Yeah.
There's certainly the idea of, these are the lands, and then insofar as we can tell, and this is particularly from things like the Babylonian map of the world, this sort of encircling sea.
I tell you what, I've got a picture of it that I've just put up here on the screen. I don't think you can see it, but I know you've probably got it memorized. So, but I just put it up on the screen for them. It's not the clearest picture in the world, but it should suffice.
Yeah, so I mean, you can see clearly there's this, ring of water around the central area, and then these radiating triangles. I like how I'm drawing it out with my hands as if that helps. That are more mystical and mythical locations. So there's certainly the idea of something, that there is something beyond their own space. It's jumping a bit in time, but one of my favorite kind of depictions of this actually comes from Herodotus, obviously jumping quite a bit in time, but he talks about going into each of the cardinal directions, and he encounters people who live at the farthest edges, and everything they do is kind of strange and wondrous. And then he has this phrase he uses with different versions, and it's basically, and beyond that there is nothing. Or there is, nothing is known, there is nothing present. And to some degree we have that same idea that beyond the sea, where you would hit the edges, it's difficult to say what would happen. We see that Gilgamesh, in his wanderings, for example, he wanders to the horizon where he encounters, what do you want, cat? Encounters these twin peaks of Mount Mashu. This other feline, the second, trying to get in some screen time. But when he moves beyond the horizon and then encounters the jewel trees, and even then he travels across the sea and finally gets to, the island of Dilmun, where the gods have placed Utnapishtim, and where immortality can also be found in this plant that he achieves and then loses. So even there, the idea of hitting the horizon, which should be a final boundary, but being able to go beyond it, suggests that the idea of a fixed border to the edges of the earth, is itself fairly fluid. So yes, the short answer is yes, but with caveats and a more malleable understanding. And also they didn't have the ability to go to the moon, which I feel should excuse them.
Well, if you don't know this, we don't have that ability either. So, and you can tell if you look in the reflection on the astronaut's mask or something. Also, those twin peaks that were guarded by the Scorpion Men, those were guarding the 🀭, which are the space vehicles to get back out.
Yes.
So, look, I feel like I'm educating you here on a lot of things. So,
I do. Just when people are like, "Oh, but what isn't it a rocket ship?" I'm like, I think it's a tree. It's a tree. Sometimes it's something other than a tree, but mostly it's a tree. On a lot of these cylinder seals, like it's a rocket ship, and like, no, it's a tree.
I never thought that I would do, and I think Megan would say the same thing. I don't think we ever thought we'd dedicate 2 hours of our lives to trying to show that the word 𝀭doesn't mean rocket ship. And yet I found myself doing it and going actually into linguistic analysis saying, okay, I don't think this person knew Sumerian, and if they did, they're
No.
hiding it extraordinarily well. But yes, so the things that you do.
I think it's important to do though, because if you don't present a counter narrative that's easily accessible and easily understandable to this idea of aliens and rockets and etc., which fundamentally I think my issue beyond the racism is that it's kind of boring. Like, isn't it far more interesting and far more exciting to believe in the ingenuity of humanity at these, thousands of years earlier in our own history? We were capable of doing all of this and had this knowledge and ability and human creativity. That's far more exciting and engaging to me than aliens. And I say this as a science fiction and fundamentally Star Trek nerd. I mean, I'd also like to believe that if there were aliens, they would have a prime directive and would have left us alone to develop our own creativity and scientific endeavor. But,
Yeah, I mean, unless the Borg come back and then, you've got this this problem of having to let us develop warp drive capabilities, but, well, it's difficult. Sorry. Okay. Feel like everybody has fallen asleep, and I apologize for that. It's my fault. Okay. Number 2. Should one exist, we all want to get to heaven. There are many different beliefs about the path to heaven today, but what was heaven in Mesopotamia? Was it another dimension? Was it a spiritual place? How did one get there? And I know that's a question full of baggage, and I apologize. I mean that physically. So, and do we have examples of that journey being taken in the textual tradition?
So I'm going to do this in a slightly out of order.
Please do.
Approach. When you die in Mesopotamia, you go to the netherworld, and you eat and drink dust for all eternity. The netherworld is not that pleasant of a place for anyone. The idea is that if you're being given offerings of water or wine by your family, which is part of the importance of having a family and having a continuation of the line that will give you offerings, then you might drink water and eat dust for all eternity. But the idea of a positive vision of the afterlife as we think of it, something paradisiacal, is not present in Mesopotamia, as you know. This idea that we get very much in Egypt, where there's the ability to get to an afterlife that contains, clean, i.e. sweet, which is to say non-salty, irrigable water and fields and pleasant lands for the rest of your eternal days, is not so much in Mesopotamia. The closest we maybe get is this text in Gilgamesh and in the Netherworld, where he describes the Netherworld and all of the babies who have died, sit and eat, I think, honey and ghee, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, for all eternity. And outside of that, it's kind of unpleasant for everyone. So there is a heaven, or the heavens, as sometimes it's plural, but it's where the gods live, and it's not a home for people. So the heavens themselves are described in different ways. They're certainly, because they're located, the word being on, or the sky, they're located above, literally in the sky. So to get to them, well, we have 2 examples of this happening, right? In Adapa, which is a text that we have first. Actually, I think our earliest copies of it are from Amarna, around the, say, 14th, 15th centuries, BC, as ever. There, Adapa is out fishing in his boat, and he speaks because the wind is blowing, and he gets angry about this. And in his speech, he breaks the wing of the wind, and his speech has actual force. I like the word effective. It's actually from a book by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Lathe of Heaven, about the idea of effective dreaming. The character has dreams which then become real. So because he has this power of effective speech, of incantations, that is to say, the gods take him up to heaven. But Enki has warned him, so Enki/Ea, the trickster god, the god of magic, has warned him to not eat or drink anything in the heavens when he's there. And we have this brief interlude of Adapa to the heavens, but then he doesn't drink or eat this material, this food and drink that would give him presumably immortality, and he's returned to Earth. And there's debate about whether or not Enki was playing a trick on Adapa. I'm more fond of the idea, and this is something actually that I first heard from my advisor, Piotr Michalowski, in graduate school, that Enki was keeping the ability of incantations on Earth. Because what we see with Utnapishtim, who is made immortal, is that he's placed in Dilmun, in Bahrain. He's beyond the horizon. So to have immortality is to be moved away from the place where humans actually live, and it's to be really put off the playing field. The other ascent to heaven is, of course, what we have with Etana, where he gets carried on the back of this eagle through the layers of heaven. And here we have this idea of lower, middle, and upper heavens, which is something we also get in these, very scholarly, mystical, and explanatory texts, something that Livingston has edited in, I think it's State Archives of Assyria 3, all of which are online. State Archives of Assyria online, so you too can read them without...
Assyriologists were very generous people. That's what I...
Yeah. So here, of course, Etana, visits the high heaven of Anu, which is the highest level of heaven, and he enters through a series of gates, I think 2, associated with different deities. So there is this idea that the highest level of heaven is not only connected to Anu, but also almost like a temple complex. One of these texts, and this actually is a text that Horowitz edits in his book, KAR 307, is one of these very scholarly texts that looks at the levels of heaven as having different stones, which I find really cool. That the upper level is it Lulu Danitu, and then the one below that. Which. Yeah, I don't remember the middle one, but the middle heaven has the god Marduk in a sanctuary made of lapis, and the lowest is made of jasper, and that belongs to the stars. So there is this idea of the movements of the stars being set throughout the lowest level of heaven. But again, that's where the gods live, that's where the stars live, the constellations that they set in fixed patterns. So you don't go there unless you're a witch, and then you get burned after you're killed. Well, after you, the demonic, chaotic, primeval you, is killed, you are burned so that your spirit is forced to the heavens for the gods to deal with. So maybe not the best way to get to heaven.
Yes, and it's rarely a good thing to go there, is what...
Yes. I was rereading Etana recently, and I'd forgotten his trip back down is kind of wild, because the eagle is just...
Such a dick.
We're flying, and then just boots him off his back and catches him, when he's almost at the next level, and he does it again, and then he catches him a meter down above the ground.
It's probably one of the earliest abusive relationships in literary text that you could see. Oh, you're afraid of heights? Oh, okay, cool.
And he spends months helping the eagle because it's trapped in a pit, and then the eagle takes him to heaven, and then on the way down is just hey, it'd be fun if you got to experience free fall for innumerable stretches of terror before I caught you again.
Should be great. Yeah, and again, it turns out that was also a rocket ship. The Eagle was a rocket ship. And we know that. I mean, it's demonstrable, Gina, because we know that we have a parallel in modern times that when the astronauts landed on the moon, they said, the Eagle has landed. Case closed. So...
How could we not know? It was right there in front of us. All this time. All the signs we've ignored.
I feel like you're unconvinced, which is really distressing.
Yeah, ever so slightly.
Okay. In the biblical text, one tradition speaks of the waters coming through the sluice gates or lattice work of heaven to fall back to the earth. describing a significant body of water existing above the heavens. Do we have parallel ideas for that in Mesopotamia?
So, I actually did some digging when you sent me this question, and I was curious because we certainly have this idea that, in Enuma Elish, the Babylonian myth of creation, Marduk kills Tiamat, who is, of course, the Great Salt Sea. Her name itself is Tontu, the sea. And then after she's dead, he creates the heavens and the earths from her body, pins her tail as the bond between heaven and earth. So because she is materialized as a giant dragon monster, but also originally the sea, we do have a sense of this original idea to some degree, at least, that the heavens were crafted from the ocean. And there's one reference, and of course now I'm not in a scholarly text or even a commentary, I'm trying to remember exactly where it just says the heavens composed of water. But outside of that, it doesn't seem to be as prevalent of a concept. And mostly when we're looking at where a body of water, particularly of non-salty water, would be, it's linked to the Apsu, which lies beneath the earth and is the home of Enki or Ea. Should just pick a Sumerian or Akkadian name and run with it.
Always do Sumerian in those moments.
It is, of course, my default. So this is where Enki lives in his abode. So it's linked to some degree to Eridu, as that is his city, but it's also occasionally linked to other locations. So while there's not, I would say, a complete absence of a link between the heavens and water and the presence of rain in that context, really we're locating this underground source of water rather than above in the sky. Outside of, as I said, these more scholarly and literary examples.
Yeah. And I mean, this is one of the difficulties, right? I mean, and I think everybody should be aware of this as we go through this. If you don't work with ancient texts or haven't, I guess, thought about them, let me say it a slightly different way. There's a scholar who is I think he's an astronomer here online, and a very reputable astronomer, I believe. And yet he tends to deal sometimes at length with ancient texts, which I have this saying that I use in other areas of my life where I say, stay in your lane. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't, try to become multidisciplinary, but until you know how to drive in that lane, it's always good to have somebody drive with you. I don't know. Anyway, I know that sounds really condescending, and I don't mean it that way.
I think there's a great benefit to doing comparative work and to expanding beyond your own area of particular expertise. And I am very much engaged with looking at how Mesopotamia, or particularly the first millennium of Syria, relates to material in the Bible and relates to concepts in Greece and even later in Rome. One of the projects I someday want to work on, except it would be complicated as all get out, is to look at, we have monsters in Mesopotamia and demons that migrate into Levantine and then Greek, and then eventually even Roman contexts. But you can track some of these ideas of 𝀭, the guardian of the cedar forest, and his imagery moves into the Levant and then into Greece and becomes the Gorgon Medusa, or merges with her. It's difficult to say. So there's a lot of interest in doing something like that. Although, I'm not moving from astronomy to ancient Near Eastern studies, but it is important to be aware of, the full arc and context and grounding of the material that you're approaching as someone who didn't do extensive training in that. Yeah. Whether it's, being able to phone a friend who happens to work on that material and can tell you when you're, not quite getting the context. So I think similarly, You don't want to say, never do something outside your field. Yeah. Just be aware that you may not have the full skill set you need and what you need to do to compensate for that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a formally trained Assyriologist, and yet, I have a master's in theology in Old Testament studies. So I've done a lot of Hebrew, I've done a lot of Greek, and I just put a video together on the formation of the Pentateuch. But even though I have, I think, a fair amount of experience in the Hebrew Bible, there's no way on earth, as a non-Pentateuchal specialist, that I'm just going to make that video and throw it up there, even though it's introductory. And so, I contacted a good friend of mine who, does have his PhD in Hebrew Bible and said, hey, I'm pretty sure I'm good, but give it a once over, and even then you still I still have a, 30 seconds in the video where I say, this is not my specialization. So here are all my references, and anyway, but at any rate, this particular scholar makes the argument that when it says in the biblical text that God stretches out the heavens, and that word there, natah, in the Hebrew is, like pitching a tent, right? It's stretching out cloth, and it's the same sort of concept that you see in the Enuma Elish, with stretching out, the other half of Tiamat's hide. But his argument is that stretching out, he reads it as like Big Bang cosmology, so the expansion of the heavens. And so I want your, I see it in your face, your reaction to that, but I'd like to get your take on that type of hermeneutical approach, where I think taking an ancient text, and this is sort of the crux, I think, of maybe what this stream is about, taking an ancient text and taking the people that wrote or produced that ancient text and trying to read more in, particularly from a scientific aspect, read more into that text than what was intended, even though it might, in a way, fit your model. That there's a lot of danger, at least there can be a lot of danger in that. What are your thoughts on that?
So, I think there's a prevalent trend to assume a certain universalism to human experience. So I, for example, I'm a big folklore fan. Let me see if I can pull this without my entire cascade of books falling down. Will it work? Will it work? Yes, victory is mine. So, I really love, this is the Arne Thompson Uther, which is now the Hans-Jorg Uther. It's a schema for classifying folk tales that assigns basically tropes and motifs that govern folk tales across world cultures. And it's true that we certainly do get things that are very prevalent and very common, despite them originating or being present in cultures that would not have had any contact with each other. So this kind of idea, of deep structure, which is not something I want to get into now, but this idea of a universalism of human experience and understanding. That all being said, and I'm not going to, as someone who is very fond, again, of the Arne Thompson Uther folklore classification schema, it's important to understand how different their Mesopotamian understanding and interaction with the world would have been compared to us. So I can talk about something like an incantation against illness, and the fact that they saw demons as vectors of disease, and consequently a number of incantations that deal with illness that were wielded by the Ashipu, or the Mesopotamian exorcist, talk about, making sure that someone who is afflicted by this illness and the demon of this illness are quarantined, basically, that they are restricted in a section of a house or a dwelling, and their belongings must be purified before they are approached by anyone who is not stricken. And when you piece all that together, and if you looked at that without having the idea of what was going on from the Mesopotamian perspective, you would say, oh, that's a quarantine procedure. But it's a quarantine procedure because they're approaching this idea of demonic vectors of illness that can spread from person to person. And you can even see how it would have been reinforced by actually working because, hey, it's quarantine procedures work for a reason. So in that regard, we have something that seems to reinforce the idea of a universalism, but is in fact talking about a very different understanding of illness in the world. and even how the semiotics and the understanding of illness itself, things are so, I'm venturing into things I don't work on as much, but shout out to, a scholar who finished up at Yale, 🀭Konstantopoulos, who works on color and how they're thinking about color, and the words they're using for color are very different than how we think about color. And does that mean that they're understanding color differently? I mean, this is staying, I'm going to stop there to stay in my lane, so to speak. But so certainly this idea of, we have a discussion of the heavens being stretched out, of Marduk taking Tiamat and stretching her out to make the heavens. And that might imply an expansion of space, but it implies an expansion of space from the perspective of a mythical text, which is still, taking a cosmic figure's, a primeval mother of all of the gods, taking the great salt sea embodied in this figure, who is now slain in terrible battle, and then stretching her hide out to make the heavens. So, yeah, I think it's much more interesting to approach it from that perspective, and then inserting this idea of, well, they understood that there was an expansion to the universe, is, that they wouldn't have had the framework for that, and it wouldn't have been a necessary framework for them to have. So keeping in mind that even if we're arriving at this kind of, the idea of convergent evolution, even if we're arriving at the same general model, the ways in which we're getting there are very different.
Yeah.
That rambled.
Sorry. No, not at all. I think it was very apt. And as a side note, Shanti and I spent many a day rolling. She was much better at it than I was. We were in tubing together, rolling up those little cigarettes. And I always made mine look like a joint. Which, wasn't a good thing. And it was funny, there was a guy out there studying with us, and I can't remember his name now, but he was trying to say a doobie. It looked like a doobie, and he kept calling it a doogie, which I thought was absolutely priceless. No, but Shanti and I sat by the water many, many times, discussing a number of things, including ideas of color. And yeah, she's amazing. She's amazing. If, as a side note here, I know we just passed the hour mark, and I don't want to intrude on your time too much more. If you, in the audience, I don't have the side chat open because I get distracted, which is not good for our guest. But Megan is watching, and I did see a question that came through. If you do have questions, audience, please put it in the side chat, mark it at Digital Hammurabi, and Megan will text it to me. So I got two more questions, and then we'll go to the audience if that works for you.
Okay.
I know it sounds so corny when I read these questions, but I don't know. Oh, well. Let's come back down to earth. There is a phrase that appears in the biblical and ancient Near Eastern texts, the four corners of the earth. Could we talk about what this meant and what it implied about the shape and size of the earth?
Yeah, so this phrase is 𒀭in Sumerian, or as we're, I think, more used to seeing it in Akkadian, this kibrat erberti. I think I inserted an extra R in there, but let's roll with it. Erbeti, rather. So the idea of the four corners is also used to justify this idea that Mesopotamia conceived of a flat view of the world, so to speak. But basically, it's dividing land into quadrants, and this is actually linked to a number of things, but also the concept of there being four winds and where they're coming from, and the winds themselves have geographic links. Beyond that, so the west wing is or the wind coming from the west is linked to Amuru, more specifically the west. I think the east wind is linked to the mountains, which would have been located to the east in Mesopotamia. But beyond that, we have this duality a lot of the times. That's duality squared, I suppose you could say, with these texts where, so this shows up a few times in Lugalbanda and in Merkar as well, where they talk about having dominion that extends from the upper land to the lower land, and then from the sea of the rising sun to the sea of the setting sun, or insert other geographic markers here. And in other Sumerian texts, you'll get a list of 5 or 6 lines of these from the upper to the lower, from X to Y, and so on and so forth, with other descriptors marking each of these markers of extremity. So what we're really seeing, I think, is this way of viewing the world that marks these points of furthest distance, and then marks one for upper and lower, and then one for west and east. Where this gets interesting is, of course, the markers of distance shift based on what's most useful. So this is really annoying if you're ever trying to pin down discussions of the sea, particularly in Assyrian royal inscriptions. The lower sea is pretty universally the Persian Gulf. And it's easy to see why there isn't another big body of water that would be located to the south, or the south and the east, because it's also lower sea of the rising sun. But the upper sea can be the Mediterranean. It can be the Caspian, I think once. It can be Lake Van. I think it can even be Lake Ormia, depending on what body of water happens to be the extent of where they're campaigning and what is significant to mark as this is the upper sea. And when they're speaking of it, they may use the phrase, the 4 corners, but they'll also use these from X to Y. And what marks the furthest boundary can shift depending on what's most important for that particular period. But there is certainly a use of marking, I would say, liminal, if not cardinal points.
Do you think that it has implications? So what I'm thinking of here is one of the first discussions that I had on YouTube. It's on our channel. It's with a very intelligent guy. I want to say he's a biologist, no, maybe not, astrophysicist. Yeah, I can't remember. They're not really similar, are they? But he's really smart. But we were arguing. We were discussing the flood in Genesis 6-9, right? And one of the things that we were talking about is the use of the word Eretz as land, right, or earth. And of course, when a 21st century individual that doesn't know about ancient texts reads in their King James Bible, the flood swept over the earth, they're picturing that ball. And, wow, how can the water, go so high? And so then the argument becomes, well, Eretz can mean a restricted land area, right? Which is just extraordinarily common in Semitic languages, that sort of thing. And just really in many languages, that sort of, I think fluidity is there. But nonetheless, so then the argument is, well, they're just saying that it flooded that local region. What I want to ask you is, I suspect that those two things, the entirety of the world and that region, are not dissimilar. That when it talks about flooding the Eretz, flooding the land, flooding the earth, that it's describing what we see in Etana. As Etana goes up, Hurwitz talks about this in his book, right, where he's looking at that landmass. That landmass is the earth. So it's not, I suppose by our estimation, it would be considered localized because it covers the region that they considered to be the world. But what are your thoughts on that?
So I think Etana is the good example here. And a part of me always finds Etana, I love the text, but it's a little frustrating as someone who wants to talk about the edges of things. And he just goes up on the eagle and the world just gets smaller and smaller until it seems to disappear, but the text doesn't talk about what is. It's like Herodotus. Beyond that, there is nothing. Yeah. It doesn't talk about what's beyond the land and even the ocean encircling it once it fades away from appreciable view when he ascends into the higher levels of heaven. So, this idea that I'm trying to think what's the occasion. I think it's Dadmu. I'd have to check. The top of my head, for the entirety, that's also used with land.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
Yeah. Probably something I should remember, but anyway, the idea of this entirety being different in any way from the land that is appreciably connected to their own interests is, I think, yeah, as you've suggested, somewhat disingenuous. And this is really suggested by them having this shifting ability to mark what is the upper sea or the upper land. And to them, in the context of this text and the campaign, it might be describing this is the uppermost boundary. And then the lowermost boundary might be more fixed, probably because the Persian Gulf is what it is. But that's the territory that they're interested in, and they might describe that as being the entirety. And for that particular text and that context, it would be. So, I mean, if we're working with the idea that the land is encircled by a great salt sea, then flooding it is not necessarily as difficult as we might imagine.
Yes.
Yeah, you just raise it up a little and it meets in the middle and it's fine. But again, this comes back to the shifting perspectives, and there's a fluidity to the understanding of the world that I think is also important to be aware of, that even though some of these locations like Magan and Meluha are incredibly distant, texts can invoke, I think Sargon does this, the idea that he makes ships dock at the quay of Agade from Magan, Meluha, and Dilmun. And to what degree that's reflective of reality is difficult to say, certainly trade being a present connection with those distant lands. But if when they're talking about flooding all of the earth, they're also including these distant lands that are already semi-mythical within that flooding, short of finding a reference to them also being flooded, which I'm pretty sure we don't have, it would be, I think, what they're focused on is, for their intents and purposes, the entirety.
Yeah. I think just so that everybody kind of understands, the bigger point for me is, when we come to, and I've said this before, but when we come to the Enuma Elish as 21st century people, we read about the sea being cut in half, and the eye sockets being used as the source of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and that doesn't bother us because we don't worship Tiamat, and so we don't try to reconcile that to what we understand of the source of the Tigris and the Euphrates right now, or the scientific or historical aspects of that. I'll say, unfortunately, when we come to something like the biblical text, given its interpretation throughout the millennia, and modern understandings of it, there seems to be, even though much of what I think mainstream Christianity's reaction to it has been, as time has gone by and scientific developments or science has developed, that we've molded our understanding of the biblical text to match that, or at least to allow it to fit. But there are certain, I think, hermeneutical approaches to the text that see it as this inspired and inerrant in all respects text, and then that causes people to come at it in a way that is different from another ancient Near Eastern text, and it leads to these types of unnecessary and illogical reconciliations, I think. So, yeah.
I mean, I have not been to the Creation Museum, perhaps a state that I will exist in for the rest of my life. It's very expensive, apparently. But you have this, I mean, obviously it's propagating an agenda and a narrative. I mean, many museums will in some regard, but this is a very particular agenda and very particular narrative. And I remember my museum studies professors went and reported back. They did this with museums throughout the year, and we would study them as case studies. And I mean, it tries to use science to back up the young Earth narrative and things like, well, how X, Y, and Z, how all of this data that we have from things. I think one of the examples they use is the Grand Canyon. actually tells us things are 10,000 years old and stuff like that. So, you know, it's to use the Sherlock Holmes quote, it's one must never reason before they have all of the facts. Otherwise, people twist facts to suit theories rather than theories to suit facts. And it's doing that. It's wanting to have a narrative and believing in that narrative, and furthermore believing in the infallibility of that narrative. And consequently, anything that contradicts that narrative, even coming from a factual, scientific, or otherwise scholarly perspective, must be somehow rejiggered to work with that narrative, because otherwise the infallibility of that narrative must be questioned, and that's not permitted if you're approaching this material from this perspective. Yeah. And it's, No,
and it's, well, I'll tell you, and I'm feeling my my phone vibrate, so we do have some questions. But one of the things I think that concerns me maybe the most about that approach is that if, let's take something like Pentateuchal studies, wherever one comes down, be it on source criticism or form criticism, seeing sources or seeing smaller texts that are edited with layers over time, however one sees that. If there is an editorial process that does not include Moses being the single author of the Pentateuchal text, the reaction is, in my experience, nothing less than visceral to that idea. And what happens, and I see it in my own life with people that are around me, and of course now people here on YouTube, if your belief structure requires single Mosaic authorship in this particular instance, and scholars, the consensus, the majority of scholars that are in the field doing this work are coming and saying it's an edited text, it's much later than you think, it's not written by one person, that's obviously wrong. And now it paints in that person's mind, and oftentimes in that religious, I can't think of the word, denomination, that's not the right, what I want to call it, but that group that holds to that can often paint with a very broad brush all of academic scholarship as not only incorrect, but corrupt, having its own agenda. And now you have a generation, at least in that particular those particular religious groups, that are raised to think that scholarship is actually bad, and that Satan has control, of scholarship, and it's very dangerous, I think, for all involved, because on the one hand, you have a very undereducated, intentionally undereducated group of people, but. So on our side, normal society side, that's bad to have undereducated people. But on in the inside of this group, you end up having kids that go to college, right? And they come in very strong and say, no. And then they are confronted with the data and go, oh, damn. and now, as opposed to having a tempered, realistic, balanced approach to spirituality and to these ancient texts and how they relate to one another, they're gone, and they become atheists or agnostics or whatever. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but it's detrimental to that core of people, because now they lose adherence. So anyway, we've gone far afield, and I'm sorry about that. But
I taught a course, Demons and Monsters in the Ancient and Biblical World. One of the things I didn't anticipate happening was that we did demons and monsters in Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, and then we entered the biblical world. And my students kind of hated on monotheism, because under polytheism there's this flexibility to include other gods. I mean, this is why we call the pantheon of the Hittite pantheon, I think it's 1,000 or even the 10,000 gods of Hatti, because they just it's a very Borg approach to things. It just assimilates in. But But of course, if you have a monotheistic system, it doesn't necessarily permit that flexibility, except in interesting ways where it kind of does. If then, you get something like the pantheon of saints, which functions very much in a similar way to a lower tiered pantheon of deities under certain periods and in certain aspects. And that interplay between monotheism when it's overlaying a polytheistic system is really interesting for that regard. But this idea of having a flexibility inherent in a system is, when you remove that flexibility and then you're confronted with something that requires it, it becomes a very difficult thing to reconcile, I think. Yeah. And sometimes, it's a reconciling that can occur, and sometimes it just becomes a rejection, as you've said, of either the scholarship or of the religious tradition that didn't permit that scholarship to counter it.
Yeah. It's that's where we are. All right. Well, I was going to do question 5, but you already answered it because it was about the Babylonian map of the world. So
yes, good old BM 92687. Yeah, as you can guess, I've talked about the text a bit.
So we do have a number of audience questions, and then I don't want to keep you because we've gone an hour and 23 minutes. So if you don't mind answering a couple of questions.
No, not at all.
Perfect.
I'm happy to answer questions.
All right. And as I said I don't know if you watched the interviews that we did for the HAP scholarship today, but as I said to them, please feel free to say, I don't know. It's one of the things that I've learned doing this, because they will ask anything. And I have to say, I don't know.
I'm happy to say it's not my division.
Now, if they do ask about the moo, I'll feel that one. Don't worry.
Okay. What about how Dinger is the blazing rockets of the pure shining ones? Is that, I think, how it was? Yeah, let's stay away from that entirely. It's perhaps for the best.
Yes, because it's read Din Gear. Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
There was nothing more satisfying than writing a nasalized G in that presentation. You see that? That's where your NG sound comes from. Okay. Intellectual Iconoclasm asks, did the concept of secularism ever exist in any form in ancient Mesopotamia? That's a nice question. Ever exist in any form?
Yeah. So it's always difficult to say to what degree the religious traditions that we're looking at would have been believed in and practiced. This is in part because we don't have that much, most of the excavations were done at palaces and temples because that's where a lot of the cool stuff is, and that it becomes very difficult to dig in basically Iraq for long periods of time, although there are digs going on in the south now, which is really exciting. And so when we look at what's going on in household contexts, we're working off of very often less data, both archaeological and textual. But when we do look at places where we have that information, whether it's from, households that have been excavated in Mesopotamia, or increasingly, if we look at the Old Assyrian period, where we are doing a lot of work in household contexts, because digging in Turkey, we do see evidence for a fitting of a lot of the ideas that we're working with into a household context. So we have Lamashtu amulets in Old Assyrian contexts that are, taking these ideas and personalizing them in a way that suggests a certain buy-in. In Assyria, we have foundation deposits of monstrous figures that were used protectively, beneath windows and doorways and corners and liminal areas that would have been entry points to attack. So that certainly suggests that while what's going on in the temple idea of religion, which is its own world in a lot of ways, and outside of processions is not one that people would have had access to, i.e. people, the masses, the common folk. It's not so distinct that they're not buying into some shade of the same system. The reason why I think the short answer is probably not is because if you're dealing with a system where religion and the state, quote unquote, are intertwined, to opt out of religion is to opt out of the state on some level. And, until fairly late in human history, mostly you just starve to death if that happens. You can't really do it. It's hard to get by. So whether or not, of course, people are believing in everything is something that we can't necessarily say for certain in all contexts and all periods. But there's at least evidence for a participation in the system. Yeah. So I think where I'll stop.
No, I think that's fair. Pat Pezzi asks, what was the knowledge of geometry in Mesopotamia? Comparable to Egypt or less advanced?
Oh, okay, so this might be one of the ones where I go, I am not as much an ancient math person. What I will say is, and also I'm not an ancient math and Egypt person, so I am not going to answer this in great detail. What we do have is fairly sophisticated calculations for astral movement, and also, of course, and I think ISA did an exhibit on this, basically the Pythagorean theorem, as you know, is found on a cuneiform text well before Pythagoras. So there's a fairly advanced knowledge of ancient mathematics. Eleanor Robson has a great book on ancient math, I think from 2014. Not sure about that date, but it sounds right to me. Eleanor Robson, professor at UCL, that is to say, who has a great Twitter, by the way. But I honestly don't know enough about math in ancient Egypt to know the level of comparative standing. What we do know about, Egyptian math is certainly advanced enough, and this always drives me crazy when the pyramid alien people are like, but the pyramids reflect certain positions of the sun and the stars. And it's like, yes, they made that on purpose. It was designed. So there's an advanced knowledge of mathematics there too. But that's kind of where my knowledge of Egyptian mathematics ends.
I think that's very fair. Iron Charioteer asks, if there were people in that time, if there were people in that, we're going to assume that. Sorry, I read that poorly. If there were people in that time that did think the earth was round. Oh, I see.
Okay.
Let me rephrase it.
Is this a Galileo kind of question?
No, because he said, ask Gina, if, so that's where I started the question, but it's, I think the comma there is. So, were there people in that time that did think the earth was round?
I would say it's, again, impossible to say for certain. The material we have, we don't have anything that suggests understanding of the earth that is spherical, or oblique spheroid, I think is technically what we would want to go with there. Oblong, whatever. So, it's possible, but there's a great bit in, I think, the film that was recent, a few years ago, done on Agora. I think it's called, on an ancient, very prominent female Greek mathematician whose name I'm blanking on, to my regret. And they have this one bit where she determines that there's an elliptical orbit of the Earth. And you're like, I don't know if we had that evidence. All of the writings we have are excerpted of her. But so the short answer is we don't have any evidence for that. Yeah. It seems unlikely based on what we do have as evidence.
That's a good answer. B. Havens asks, were there societies at the Gulf's edge which are now underwater?
So interestingly, it kind of works the opposite way for us, because the cities that we have, so the city of Ur, something I always have to tell my students is that Ur was a port city. It's just not anymore. So the edge of the Gulf has actually crept southward over the intervening millennia. So instead, we have cities that were by the sea and are now no longer. Their interactions with the locations they're talking about, at least, don't suggest that any of them were submerged. I do wonder if that person is thinking about something like Lemuria, which is this mystical proto-place that is kind of in the Indian Ocean and is a submerged continent now, or the myth of a submerged continent from which, great wonder once lived. But we don't have anything like that spoken of in texts.
I want to say that was phenomenal wordplay that you had there. Or was a port city, but it's not anymore. It's awesome. I didn't know it was intentional. Nick J., have you read any of the material by Bodhi Hodge of Answers in Genesis? If so, do you think he gave a good researched report? I'm going to answer the question for you.
I have not, is the short answer. So
he has not, is also the short answer. I have not read, I've heard him speak. And so I'm basing that. I would say if what he says is indicative of how he writes from a scholarship standpoint, I would say probably not. But yeah, okay. But that question wasn't for me, so you can disregard my answer.
I have not read any of these works by this individual, so I'm afraid I can't offer much to it.
It's part of the Creation Museum.
Oh, yeah. I don't generally have high hopes for answers in X, biblical, insert book of the Bible here.
I don't know that you're going to have a lot of answers in Song of Solomon, probably, but and I guess that could be like a porn site or something, but sorry. All right. Last question. Intellectual Iconoclasm asks, it's been my contention that control over women grew with animal husbandry. Lineage became important for breeding stock and likewise for societies. Please ask if that is observed.
So there's an interesting kind of line of scholarship that has this idea that, it's mostly discussed and debunked in a lot of ways, but this idea that the Sumerians, quote unquote, were more feminist, and then the Akkadians also, quote unquote, because the idea of linking languages to ethnic groups is inherently problematic and not really held up by the data. I know. Yeah, also ethnicity and names, problematic idea. In late period Babylon, we see people, I think in Hellenistic Babylon, people can have 2 to 3 different names based on what language and group they're interacting with. Different names in different languages, I should state or clarify. So I think what we do see is that we're certainly dealing with patriarchal societies. This much is clear. But we're dealing with patriarchal societies with a certain give to them. So the short answer is I don't know of a line of evidence that cohesively links the rise of a patriarchal society to the rise of animal husbandry. But what we do see in Mesopotamia that I do think is very interesting there are periods where women are allowed to achieve greater agency and authority. Carol Clover, who is a scholar who works on Norse material, among other things, has a really great article called Regardless of Sex that talks about gendered insults in Norse and Icelandic sagas. And she talks about the idea of a 2-gender versus 1-gender society, where a 2-gender is very much men and women, never the twain. And a 1-gender is the idea that if in a patriarchal 1-gender society being a woman is a minus, it can be overcome with other pluses. Wealth, standing, a forceful personality, I think is one of the ones that's really great to consider. So there are periods where women work in ways that men would otherwise. So sometimes this is in very specific religious contexts, like the Naditu, women in the cloister in the Old Babylonian period who have control of their own finances, and so on. We have a really interesting example of a man in, this is a text from the Periphery in the West, where I'm trying to remember the exact date and I can't, but he doesn't have any sons or other, comparable male family figures. So he legally makes his daughter his son and heir and writes her as such until she marries, and then, he adopts her husband as his son. But there is a period where his daughter is basically legally considered his son because, again, to quote Clover here, this is apparently also happened in Norse material, better a daughter who is your son than no son at all. And of course, in the old Assyrian period, when women who were wives of these merchants were holding up one end of this 1,000-mile long trading network, they had a lot of their own power and agency and literacy to write, economic documents, but necessity is the mother of both agency and literacy in this period. So to say that, X equaled patriarchy is, I think, not what we're getting. We're getting a patriarchal system that has give to it when required, and women are able to assert themselves in different ways and in different contexts. And that's actually, I think, a far more, it's an interesting thing when it happens, and it happens in a lot of really, subtle but quite intriguing ways. We don't necessarily see something like we get in Egypt where we have women who are queens. There are a few kind of borderline cases, but we don't have anything like Hatshepsut, alas, because she's cool. But we do have periods where women who, royal women are acting as regent rule in certain contexts. But so even though it is a patriarchal system throughout all of Mesopotamian history, it's a patriarchal system with interesting bits of give, where women have this power and agency in different roles and in different contexts and periods.
Yeah. Well, this has been amazing, and we've gone now an hour and 40 minutes, and I've just thoroughly enjoyed this. And
I had a great time. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you for coming on, and yeah, I hope maybe we haven't scared you off too much, and maybe you can come back on.
No, I know the minute I sign off, I will immediately remember the name of this, mathematician in Alexandria that I am completely blanking on.
I think it's Sally. Sally
yes,
was her name.
Sally.
So yeah,
Sally, the noted Greek mathematician in Alexandria. That is, of course, how things go. But that's all right. Just shame my.
Just tweet it. That's all. And so just, if you could just take 2 seconds, because I think that's important. If you want to let people know where they can find you on Twitter.
Yes. So I am, of course, I say this and I'm like, what is my Twitter handle?
Sally is what it is,
yes.
actually.
Hypatia. There we go. Not me, the mathematician. It was not me, but was in Alexandria. That's who I was trying to remember. So I am GVKONSTA at Twitter, but I just show up if you basically Google Gina Konstantopoulos. It's unusual enough. You have to then spell, though, Konstantopoulos, yes. So it's a bit difficult. But yes, I mostly tweet about cuneiform demons and occasionally my cats, because that's what they're there for, I suppose.
3 best things. Well, Dr. Konstantopoulos, thank you so much for coming on, and we've loved it, and I know the audience has too, and hopefully we can get you back on to talk some more about demons.
Yeah, I would love it. Demons are great, and they're an easy sell for a fun time.
Indeed, indeed. Well, everyone, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?